You're listening to the Bug Bucks Podcast, hosted by Alan Draper and Eric Bassett.
Welcome to the Bug Bucks Podcast, a podcast designed to help you become a bug money millionaire. Today's episode is brought to you by Bug Bucks Plus, the #1 course designed to help you start and grow your pest control company. I am your host, Eric Bassett, and I am flying solo today while Alan is traveling. Before we begin, I just want to remind everybody listening, the best way to receive new episodes is by subscribing to our show on your preferred platforms, such as Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you love the show, please leave us a rating and a review. And one last reminder, if you haven't joined our Facebook group, go to Bug Bucks, that is BUGBUX. We love to hear from our listeners. Today we're breaking down what it takes to build and maintain a high-performing inside sales team. I get questions about inside sales all the time, especially during the busy season when leads are coming in. I've compiled a list of the 10 most common questions I get, and I'm going to provide you guys with what I feel are the best actionable answers based on my experience building and managing inside sales teams over the years. For simplicity's sake, I've also organized these into chronological order, from knowing where to start to developing effective long-term leaders. There is going to be a much more involved and detailed inside sales course coming to the Bug Bucks Plus training platform. So if you're listening and you're looking for more info, that platform is for you. If you guys know me, you know that I can be a little long-winded with my information. So for the sake of time, I'm going to go through my list of the 10 categories, but I'm only going to be able to cover the first 5 in this episode. The rest is going to be part of that Bug Bucks Plus course. I'm going to start off by rattling off these 10 questions so that you guys can have a good idea what's going to be covered in this episode. If you want more specific info, please let us know in our Facebook Bug Bucks group, and I'll make sure to include it in the upcoming course. Side note, the question of whether to have a dedicated inside sales team versus a hybrid customer service team who also doubles as a sales team comes up a lot. That's a big question to unpack, and I actually teach a course specifically about that on our Bug Bucks Plus platform, so I would highly encourage you to check that out if that's a question you've been asking yourself. All right, here are the top 10 most common questions about inside sales that I get. Question number 1, when do you need to create an inside sales department? Question number 2, how do you find the right candidates for an inside sales team? Question number 3, what does the onboarding process look like for inside sales? Question number 4, what does a compensation plan for inside sales look like? And question number 5, what metrics should you be measuring? Those are the 5 categories that I'm going to be covering today. The other 5 categories that are going to be covered in the Bug Bucks Plus course are going to be, what does the day-to-day management look like? How do you get your inside sales team to perform at their best? How do you know when to expand your team? How do you choose an inside sales manager? Like, do you promote from within or hire from outside the organization? And what KPIs should you be discussing with your inside sales manager? So, lots of good stuff to unpack here. Let's go ahead and dive in with these first 5 questions. So question number 1, when do you need to create an inside sales department? So in the early days of growing your business, the amount of inbound leads that are coming in over the phone are likely to be relatively few and far between. And that's going to change as your brand awareness grows within your market and your customers start referring you to friends and family. The lead volume will continue to increase as you focus on local SEO or the SEO of your Google My Business listing, along with any other optimizations you make in order for customers to find you more easily. Combine that with an effective digital marketing strategy with paid campaigns, and you'll end up with a regular lead volume that increases year over year. And that brings us back to the original question. The moment that you need to start creating an inside sales team is when the founders and initial operators of the company can no longer handle the incoming lead volume and effectively manage the other operations of the business. A ringing phone, especially a potential customer, is always going to fall into the urgent and important category, which will keep an owner-operator stuck on the phone, or worse, missing those calls entirely because they've got other things to execute on in the business. That moment when you hand off the inside sales duties to someone else could be earlier if you feel like that person could be more effective at closing and converting leads than the owner-operator is. The difficulty is having enough lead volume to keep that new inside salesperson busy. High-performing salespeople in the pest control industry usually require a full-time level of engagement in order to develop their skills. However, that doesn't mean that you can't start with a part-time salesperson. Just keep in mind that the time it takes to fully get them up to speed will be longer. This is where using hybrid reps that take both customer service and sales calls come in handy. More about that info in our BugBucks Plus course. If you're currently operating without an inside sales team and you're taking inbound leads yourself, make sure you keep this on your radar. It's better to pull the trigger on this a little too early than it is to wait and have your operations suffer or miss inbound sales opportunities. Moving on to question number 2. How do you find the right candidates for an inside sales team? Finding good quality candidates for a sales team can definitely be tricky. It's important that if you're using any type of recruiting platform, that you lead with sales in the job title and description. The last thing you want to do is waste your time interviewing candidates who aren't attracted to a sales position. It's all right to specify that this can be an entry-level position, but sales experience, especially in the pest control industry, would be highly valued in the selection process. Most successful salespeople have a few personality traits in common, although it's not always the case. Most are good conversationalists with warm and engaging personalities. They are performance-driven and thrive where their accomplishments are measured and appreciated. They are not only expectant of performance evaluations, but enjoy regular and consistent coaching and development. They have a "let me prove it to you" kind of response when it comes to challenges, and are open and honest about their struggles, and look for guidance when it comes to improvement instead of hiding behind excuses. They believe in a high level of accountability, and they are very detail-oriented, easily buying into the power of following a system or a process. So, can these traits be trained into someone? Well, it's possible, but usually unlikely. It's far easier to identify traits like this during the hiring process than it is to identify the lack thereof and invest time and effort trying to build someone into something they aren't. I also can't stress enough how important it is that the people you hire work well with the other members of your team. Having a toxic team member will only bring your organization down no matter how high-performing they are. Team chemistry is something that can make or break an organization. Moving on to question number 3. What does the onboarding process look like? The early success of your inside sales department will be highly dependent on how effective and organized your onboarding process is. We're going to assume that you've already taken care of all the necessary paperwork and you're moving on to the actual training process. The specific ins and outs will depend on the company, but here are a few things that you'll definitely want to include. First off, every new hire at your company can benefit greatly from learning about the company's conception in the early days of operating. Take the opportunity to tell your story and share your company's purpose and core beliefs. You want that new hire to connect with your company personally and on a deeper level than just a typical employee/employer relationship. If you only hire someone who needs a job, they'll only work for you for the money. But if you can get that person to believe what you believe in, they'll work for you with blood and sweat and tears. Don't forget the impact you can make by sharing your company's mission and purpose with those new hires. Number 2, whether or not your new hire has pest control experience, they need to know how pest control works in the format of how it's performed by your company. In a lot of cases, it's even more important if they have previous experience in pest control, so you can avoid them misrepresenting your company or carrying over any bad philosophies or habits they learned elsewhere. New hires should learn the basic entomology of pests that you treat, the products you use, and the fundamentals of how they work, the equipment the technicians use and why, and how services are performed from general pests to more specialized applications. If you can add in some key philosophies about integrated pest management, that also helps. I know this probably sounds like a lot, but the more your new hire understands about pest control in general, the more confident they're going to be when they are speaking with customers. You don't have to cover every single thing you've ever learned, but you should provide as much as you can in a small, digestible size piece that your new hire can absorb. The next thing your onboarding process needs is an effective and organized communication or sales process. If you're anything like me, you'll want to make sure your brand and service is sold and represented in a way that you'd be proud to hear. I've listened to too many embarrassing sales calls to count, and 9 times out of 10, it's because the rep was never taught a specific process to follow. It's important to remember that selling pest control is just as unique as performing pest control, and it requires philosophies, systems, and processes to guide your employees. Otherwise, they'll spend all day stumbling through calls with no idea why. Just to clarify, I'm not talking about your salesman reading a script word for word. I'm talking about teaching them an intentional way to communicate and sell the service to your potential customers. If you're listening and thinking, I have no idea where to even start, just write out your pitch and break it down into sections and make note of what you say and why you say it. If teaching a sales process isn't something that's in your wheelhouse, consider hiring a sales training consultant. The last thing your onboarding process needs is a thorough training of the CRM and other systems you use on a daily basis that the rep will come in contact with. Your salesman's efficiency is limited by how effective they are at navigating and using these systems. Most modern CRMs and communication platforms aren't all that complicated, but don't think that you can just drop them in front of the computer and phone and expect them to just learn on the fly. I highly suggest having documented directions with quality photos that the rep can read through, or instructional videos that they can watch, or an opportunity to shadow you while you walk through the job. Realistically, you'll want all three. Keep in mind that people learn differently. Some need visual and auditory methods, while others need tactile and kinesthetic methods. Most need a combination, and they need repetition before it really sinks in. The best way that I found to use the shadow training process is first to have them sit with you with a phone they can use to listen in. They'll listen to what you say and watch you navigate the system. Once they've done that for a few hours or through 5 to 10 customers, the next step is to have them navigate the system while you continue to talk on the phone with them listening in. You'll be able to take over and drive if necessary, but they'll get used to navigating without having to use their brain power to engage in conversation. Next, you switch, where they are now the primary person talking with customers and you are navigating and listening in on the call. This allows them to use their brain power to engage in the conversation without having to remember where to navigate. Lastly, you put it all together and they talk with the customer and navigate while you listen in on the phone. Each of these steps can take 1 to a few hours depending on call volume, but the important part is that they absorb information and learn. On average, it's going to take your new hire anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks before you feel confident leaving them on their own all day, about 2 to 4 weeks before you start to see their training really pay off, and about 4 to 8 weeks before you will consider them proficient. Even then, there's always going to be questions, mistakes, and issues with performance. And that's where ongoing development and training come in, which we'll cover in a different question. Moving on to question number 4. What does a compensation plan for inside sales look like? I'm sure at this point you've probably seen or at least heard of all kinds of different pay plans for salespeople. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds here, so I'm just going to explain some common types and maybe a few key philosophies surrounding them. So the first type of compensation is 100% hourly. You figure out what you feel is a fair hourly amount for the work that your salesperson does. They clock in and clock out, and that's about as complicated as it gets. The obvious pro here is simplicity. The con has to do with the philosophy that is as old as sales itself, which is pay for performance or performance-based pay. When it comes to sales, the quality of performance has a lot to do with what you're willing to pay for it. A high-performing salesperson is much more valuable to you than a low-performing one. If you have a compensation plan that includes bonuses or commissions, the high-performing reps will make a higher wage naturally, which will drive the low-performing reps to improve. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't do 100% hourly, but no matter what you do, you should still absolutely have metrics that you measure to show whether or not your sales rep is performing to the level of your expectations. We'll talk more about metrics in question number 5. The second type of compensation plan is a combination of hourly and performance-based bonuses. Just to be clear, These would be flat bonus amounts based on key levels of performance, not commissions, which we'll jump into here in just a minute. A performance-based bonus example could be a $25 bonus if your salesperson ends the week with a closing rate at or above a specific level. You could even have it tiered with increasing amounts at higher percentages. You could also change up the frequency and do it daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, or even annually. The pro for the salesperson is that they get compensated when they perform well. The pro for the company is that there is no extra compensation when the salesperson doesn't perform well. Another factor that could be a pro or a con all depends on how much revenue the salesperson generates. For example, if the salesperson generates a lot of sales revenue, the company only pays a flat bonus if that salesperson hits the right performance levels. A salesperson can still generate a lot of revenue and have bad stats. On the flip side, a sales rep might generate relatively low sales revenue, but could still be hitting above those performance metrics, which means they'll still qualify for a bonus. In this scenario, you just have to keep in mind that the percentage of revenue that bonus represents changes with sales volume. A good way to combat this issue is to create qualifiers for bonuses so that you can ensure each rep is still generating the expected amount of revenue. The next type of compensation plan is likely a popular one that you've heard and seen. This is a combination of hourly and commission. Just to make sure we're on the same page here, I'm defining commission as a percentage of the sales revenue that the person generates, assuming that the sales actually go through and the accounts will generate revenue. This might be the most original sales pay plan out there. It includes all the pay for performance-based pros that we talked about before, and since it's a percentage of revenue, what the salesperson makes in commission is always proportional to what they sell. This provides incentive for the salesman to sell high volume, which naturally seems to encourage high performance. And it provides safeguards for the company where the percentage of commission to revenue isn't variable, like it was in the last example. Salespeople who generate the most revenue make the most commission. You might be wondering what percentage and what hourly rate combinations make the most sense. That's really going to depend on the company and the market, but keep in mind that there are labor laws that require a minimum amount of pay per hour, regardless of how well or poorly a sales rep performs. I would say in most cases, the hourly pay for a salesperson should never be lower than minimum wage anyway. So once you figured out what that number is, I usually project how much revenue a sales rep is likely to generate over a given year, assuming they'll hit expected performance metrics. Then I work backward with different percentages until I come to a commission amount that, when it combines with the hourly amount, provides the salesperson a good financial opportunity and still leaves room for a healthy customer acquisition cost for the company. As a quick side note, commission-based compensation plans can also have tiered levels of commission based on high levels of performance. They can also include flat bonuses as well. There's a lot of options there. I'm going to have more detailed examples in the course that I teach on BugBucks Plus. The last type of compensation plan is usually not one you see very often, but it does exist. This is the 100% commission option with no hourly pay. Sound wild to you? That's because it is. But if you're a company that can provide a consistent flow of inbound leads year-round, and at least in as much as it provides enough compensation in the slower months, you could pull this off. And the right kind of salesman could be plenty happy with it, assuming the commission percentage still provides a good financial opportunity for them. The pro for the company is that you only pay for accounts that are sold and serviced. When the salesperson doesn't sell, you don't pay. When leads are slow, you pay less. When leads are plentiful, you pay more if the salesperson sells more. It's the ultimate safeguard for the company. The downside for the company is rooted in the downside for the salesperson. This type of pay plan is completely dependent on the company's ability to deliver enough quality leads for the salesman to close. Seasonality could also have a huge impact on lead volume and therefore the salesperson's income. Realistically, this type of plan could have the best pay of them all, but with high reward comes high risk, and most people just aren't interested in that type of position. There are a lot of unique and creative ways to combine and mix and match these pay plans to best fit your organization, along with qualifiers and safeguards you can use to benefit both the company and the salesperson. I'm going to have more examples of that in the course on BugBucks Plus. Moving on to question number 5. What metrics should you be measuring and what do they mean? Tracking inside sales metrics isn't just beneficial for you as an owner-operator. It's also crucial for your team's performance. If they don't know how they're doing, how do they know whether they are winning or losing, or what or how to improve? Some of these metrics are also important for the marketing side of your company. They provide critical data on how effective campaigns are and what kind of return on investment you're getting. Overall, tracking performance metrics are not only important, they're necessary for growth. So, let's walk through these one by one and talk about how to effectively use them as a tool. I'm going to keep these in a relatively chronological order. The first metric you'll want to be tracking is the number of leads that are coming in, along with whether or not they're qualified and the marketing source and area they came from. Tracking the number of leads comes into play when tracking other sales stats like closing and marketing stats. Let's talk about what makes a lead qualified or not. In order to be qualified, it needs to fit all of the 4 following criteria. The potential customer needs to have a pest problem that your company can handle. Number 2, the potential customer needs to reside within your service area. Number 3, the potential customer needs to be a verified decision maker. And number 4, the potential customer needs to actually respond to our attempts to contact them. So I'm guessing some of you probably want some more context, so don't worry. When it comes to having a pest issue that your company can handle, the most common question that comes up is, why are these leads coming to me? Now, in some instances, there could be keywords in your campaigns that lead Google or whichever platform to believe that that's a service you offer. So make sure you're double checking those. The other reason is annoying, but it's actually an indication of something good. As a company gains more and more market share and influence in an area, more customers will recognize your name and assume you're the one to call, regardless of what issue they have. It's a great indicator for having a healthy reputation, but it doesn't always feel that way. When it comes to pest issues that you can't service, make sure you've got a solid option to send that lead to a verified referral. Companies like Baton are designed specifically for this and give you the opportunity to sell these leads back to other companies who actually do service for those pests. When it comes to potential customers who don't reside in your service area, this can be a factor of a few things. And as you can imagine, double-checking your campaign's website and GMB profile will help a lot to ensure you've got accurate zip codes. The other reason is really similar to the last situation. Sometimes your reputation and brand awareness extends outside your service area. This is a good thing. That likely means you're getting referrals and your brand is organically growing. So let's talk about the weirdest unqualified reason. They need to be a verified decision maker. What we want here is to make sure we've got a genuine opportunity to make a sale. I'm not talking about a spouse who passes the buck to the other spouse. I'm talking about a tenant who's gathering info for a landlord, or an executive assistant who's getting quotes for their boss. As you can imagine, these are few and far between, but they happen often enough for it to make my list. The last one is pretty straightforward, but it comes with some specific rules. So in order to claim that a potential lead, like a form fill or an email, etc., never responded, we also have to ensure that our initial communication to that lead was done in a timely manner, which is usually somewhere within a few minutes. After that, we can't claim that it's their fault if we're the ones that had a bad response time. So now you've got some context as to what makes a lead qualified or not, and you can understand that your team needs to track the unqualified ones by type, so you can keep a close eye not just on how many come in, but why they're unqualified in the first place. Now we're left with tracking the number of qualified leads and the important data that comes along with it. For marketing reasons, you'll want to know what the source of the lead is and what service area they are calling from. When it comes to lead sources, you want to be able to pinpoint what factor influenced them the most to make that call. If you just ask where they got your number, you're missing out on a big part of the picture. For example, maybe a potential customer recently saw a technician in their area performing a service. They walked by and briefly talked to the technician, who told them they'd be happy to give them a quote. The person declined, but later on asked their neighbor about their experience, who gave you a glowing recommendation. They, as most people do, completely forgot about making the call until they noticed one of your ads on Facebook scrolling late at night and then decided to Google you the following morning where your number popped up. So if all you asked was, "Where'd you find our number?" you'd end up getting a generic, "Found it on Google" answer. And whoever is managing your marketing is going to lose their mind. Having source data is one of the most helpful things you can track for marketing purposes. It shows you which avenues are giving you the best ROI and which avenues aren't. When it comes to tracking service area, this is obviously much more simple once you get their address. Just to be clear though, you want to be as specific as you can, which might include dividing up your service area into a lot of smaller cities, towns, boroughs, etc. This will help your marketing team better understand which demographics your brand and campaigns are appealing the most to. So, long story short, leads break down into qualified and unqualified. The qualified leads are tracked by source and service area, and the unqualified leads are tracked by the unqualified reason. Qualified leads are defined by a salesperson having a bona fide opportunity to generate a sale. Simple, right? Maybe not so much, but it is important, and you're going to get the hang of it. The next thing we want to make sure we track isn't necessarily a metric, but it's important to the metrics we do track. You'll want to make sure that you're tracking sold revenue for initials, recurring contracts, and non-recurring customers. The reasons why that's important will become pretty obvious as we go through the next actual metrics. So, now that we've covered tracking leads and sales revenue, what's the next metric on our list? I'm sure you've heard of closing rate before, and it's a staple in the sales world, and every salesperson is judged on it. It's not overly complicated, but let's define it and make sure we're on the same page. A salesperson's closing rate is a factor of how many qualified leads make a purchase decision, regardless of whether or not what's being purchased is a recurring service, divided by the total number of qualified leads that that person handles. So if the qualified lead buys something, that's a closed lead. You might have noticed that I mentioned qualified lead and not just any lead. It's important to know that unqualified leads don't factor into closing rate or any other sales metric because they don't present a bona fide opportunity to generate a sale. The quickest way to burn out a good salesperson is to lump unqualified leads into their metrics. They'll quickly disengage and performance will drop. They need to believe that they have as much control over the outcome of their calls as possible. Unqualified leads take that control away by default. It's just not a good experience. So let's do a quick example using some simple numbers. Over the month, one salesperson handles 100 leads, 10 of which were unqualified. So out of the 90 qualified leads, the salesperson closes 65 customers who make some type of purchase decision, whether it's recurring or not. 65 divided by 90 equals a 72% closing rate, which in my experience is great. I'm sure you might be asking, what about the breakdown between recurring and non-recurring sales? Well, this next metric is for you. When a salesperson gets a customer to purchase a recurring plan, we say that they've converted them to recurring, hence the name of this metric being conversion rate. Before I continue on, I just want to specify that this is different from the marketing term conversion rate, which has to do with converting web traffic to leads or customers, etc. So let's use that same example as before. The salesperson was able to close 65 of 90 qualified leads, which gave them a 72% closing rate. They were also able to convert 53 of the 65 closed customers to a recurring plan. 53 divided by 65 equals an 81% conversion rate, which would also be great in my experience. Now, if you're a company who only ever offers recurring services, your conversion rate is always going to be 100%. However, in my experience, that usually has a negative impact on closing rate, sales revenue, and marketing options. I'll cover more about that in the BugBucks Plus course. So, now we understand closing and conversion. Now we get to dive into some of the more nitty-gritty details. The next one on my list is the average initial price. Pretty self-explanatory, but the initial service is just the first service a recurring customer receives, and a salesman's average initial price is the total combined revenue of his customer's initial services divided by the number of his recurring customers. Keep in mind that this only applies to recurring customers. We'll talk about everybody else here in a minute. So we're going to use that same example as before. The salesman was able to convert 53 of 65 closed leads for a 81% conversion rate. Now we're going to say here that his total revenue from the initials for those 53 customers received was $10,547. And if we divide that revenue by 53, we get his average initial price of $199. You might be wondering why I bothered tracking the average initial price outside of the overall contract value. And the answer is because I want to isolate as many variables as possible so the data is as clear and useful as possible. If I lump the average initial into the overall contract value and the salesperson's metrics drop, I won't know whether it's the initial value or the recurring value that's being undersold. Speaking of recurring value, let's move on to the next metric that we're going to be tracking. This is one that you've likely heard of before. It's the average contract value, or ACV. Sometimes it's also expressed as the average recurring value, and I'll explain the difference between the two. When a salesperson closes a recurring customer, they'll have an initial service, which we've talked about already, and then they'll have some amount of recurring services over the next 12 months. Regardless of the frequency of those services, the total annual value of those services is known as the contract value, which is measured separately from the initial value for the same reasons I talked about before. Let's do another example. Our salesman converted 53 of 65 closed customers to a recurring service. We already know the average initial is $199. Let's use the same formula to find the average contract value. The total of our salesperson's contract revenue is $29,150. And if we divide that number by their 53 recurring customers, we'll get an average contract value of $550. Now, whether that value is good or bad depends on the service offering and the market, but that's how you measure it. Now, when you hear the term recurring value, that's usually in reference to the recurring amount that's being billed. So in order for that to provide much context, you need to know whether a company is billing monthly as a subscription separate from the service frequency, or if they bill per service. In which case, you'd also need to know the service frequency, like quarterly, every other month, or monthly, etc. If someone is asking you about the overall contract value or your initial year contract value, just know that they usually want to know your average contract value and your average initial value combined. So, now that we've got average initial and average contract value down, let's move on to the next metric we need to track. Remember all those non-recurring customers our salesperson sold? We need to find an average non-recurring value as well. Companies who offer mostly recurring and one-time treatments will usually just call this the average one-time service price, or average 1x price for short. The reason why we track this metric is so we can verify that the value of the non-recurring services being sold meet our pricing standards. The way we figured this out uses the same formula as before. So we're going to jump into an example. Our salesman converted 53 of 65 closed customers to recurring service, which leaves 12 non-recurring customers. The total sales revenue generated by those customers is $3,588. If we divide that number by our 12 non-recurring customers, that will give us an average non-recurring value of $299. Again, whether or not that's a good value or bad value all depends on the offering and the market. Companies with multiple non-recurring service-based options, especially high-ticket offers, could end up with a wide range of dollars in this metric. So now we've got a pretty well-rounded group of metrics here. What else could there be? One that should be important to you is autopay. I'm honestly shocked at how many sales teams still seem to struggle with getting automatic payment info when it's been an option for well over a decade. But aside from the reasons teams struggle or not, tracking autopay is relatively simple. A salesperson's autopay percentage is the number of customers they've sold who've given digital payment information and permission for us to bill them at our discretion, divided by the total number of customers they've sold. You might have picked up on a few key things here. First, I allow my team to include non-recurring customers in their autopay numbers. In my experience, that encourages them to get payment info from customers who have limited interactions with us. In some ways, it's even more important to get payment info from those non-recurring customers than it is to a recurring one. The other thing I noted is that it's not just enough to have the payment information. We also need to be able to process payments at our discretion. That means if we need to contact the customer in order to get their permission to process each payment, that doesn't qualify. AutoPay is all about increasing efficiency and collections. All right, so that's got to be all of them, right? Well, that's all we're going to dive into for today. But I'm going to be going through a few others like revenue per lead, go-through rate, multi-service percentage, multi-year contract percentage, add-on percentage, and others along with examples in our Inside Sales course on BugBucks Plus. I'll also be covering the last 5 of my top 10 questions I get about inside sales, which include day-to-day management of inside sales teams, getting your inside sales team to perform at their best, knowing when to expand your inside sales team, how to choose an inside sales manager, and what kind of KPIs should you be discussing with your inside sales manager. If you're looking for a comprehensive how-to guide on creating, developing, and scaling a high-performing inside sales team, this course is for you. Just as a quick side note here, BugBucks Plus has plenty of other phenomenal content, all centered around helping you grow and scale your pest control companies. For just $49 a month, you get at least one new course each month delivered by industry experts who regularly charge significantly more than that for a single consultation call. BugBucks Plus is your opportunity to gain access to an entire network of industry-leading information for one low monthly rate. What are you waiting for? Thank you guys for joining me on this episode. If you haven't already, go join our BugBucks Facebook group. That's BUG, BUX. And until next time, keep growing those pest control companies. See ya.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please show your support by subscribing and leaving us a 5-star rating. Thank you, and we'll catch you on next week's episode.